Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut's Fall 2023 series, talking about preservation, our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm pleased to be your host. Today, we are chatting with my colleague, Renee Trubert, about a recent project that she led, discovering Connecticut's Green Book sites. Before we begin, let me give you a quick overview of Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide, private, nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation to preserve, protect, and promote the building sites and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm proud to say that for 48 years, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is here on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, Connecticut. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places and designated as an official project of the Save America's Treasures program. It's the Eli Whitney Boarding House and has served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and a board of 21 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Christopher Wiegren, our deputy director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, our Olmsted in Connecticut Landscape Survey Project, and to arrange book talks for his book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Trubert, who is running the program later today, is our Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to the state and national registers of historic places. Kristen Hopewood, Development Assistant. Kristen manages all of the inquiries that come through our websites, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, Stacy Vero, and Stefan Danchuk. They provide immediate boots-on-the-ground service to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissions, and more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, funding, and archaeology. These chats started during the pandemic, but they continue as an important tool for us to meet our mission. We're able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions directly at the end of the presentation, or contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. And many, many thanks to our sponsors today, Cronenberger and Sons Restoration and JP Franzen Associates Architects. And a preview of next week, we'll be talking with Felicia and Travis Gulick, renovation and design experts, to chat about making historic homes more livable. So I hope you'll all join us next week as well. But now we're ready for Renee. So Renee, I will stop sharing and you can pull your screen up.
Righty. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So, well, thank you for joining us on this lovely, at least at my house, sunny and mild day, when you could be outside. I'm going to start with a brief intro on the social context for the Green Book series, then talk about the origins of the Green Book intern project, and then I'll finish up with some of our findings. I do have a quick question. My screen shows this sharing bar. Is that in yours as well, or is it just a clean presentation? I'm sorry.
I see little thumbnails of everybody's video.
Okay. All right. Thanks. So I imagine most of you know the outlines of the Great Migration that started during World War I and continued into the 1970s. African Americans moved from southern states to escape racism and persecution and to find employment opportunities and freedom from fear. While many could get an education and find work in factories or service businesses, they still met with discrimination in northern states. Whites were hired for all the better paying jobs. Government and banking policies limited housing options. White-owned and operated stores and services did not always welcome their business. Though the discrimination may not have been as dangerous as in states they'd left, they suffered situations that were, at least, embarrassing and humiliating. So while expansion of automobile ownership and roads after World War II allowed mobility for many, it did not necessarily offer freedom. African Americans still had to be cautious when traveling, whether in southern or northern states. And the fact that half of all hate crimes in the past decade have been against Black reminds us all that being Black in America can still be a fraught experience. Victor Hugo Green was born and raised in Harlem. And yes, he was named for the French novelist, perhaps an aspirational name, since Victor Hugo was a man of conscience whose politics favored universal suffrage, free education for everyone, and the need to address poverty. His wife, Alma Duke Green, was part of the Great Migration, having grown up under Jim Crow, and she moved to New York from Virginia. Aware of annual publications such as the Jewish Vacation Guide, first published in 1916, and perhaps the 1930 New London-based Hackley and Harrison Hotel and Apartment Guide for colored travelers. The latter had hotel and tourist home listings in 46 states, including 34 in Connecticut, some of which later appeared in the Green Book. It also included listings in Canada. We know that Sadie Harrison welcomed guests in her own home for some 20 years, as it could be found in both guidebooks. Victor Green created the Negro Motorist Green Book in 1936, and that would be the 1937 edition when it was published. It initially covered the Metro New York area, which had its own share of places that were unsafe. He wanted to identify first-class hotels and services that welcomed Blacks. The first issue was very well met, and the 1938 issue then included locations in another 20 states and the District of Columbia. By 1949, there were locations for 48 states, the District of Columbia, Bermuda, Mexico, and Canada. And by the last issue, you could find places to stay and eat in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Central and South America, and Europe as well. Postal carrier for 39 years, and through the National Association of Letter Carriers Union Network, got places for inclusion from fellow carriers across the country. In later years, he too traveled to see and find places for the guide. 50,000 copies were published annually, except during World War II, with ever-widening listings. They were distributed by mail order, as well as through Black-owned and tolerant white-owned businesses. An important partnership was with the Negro Affairs representative of the U.S. Travel Bureau, established in 1937, to promote tourism after the Great Depression. Beginning that year, the Bureau sponsored the Green Book and promoted travel for African Americans. Starting around 1949, the guide was sponsored by Esso, thanks to collaboration with Black marketing executives there. Esso stations throughout the country were to welcome Black travelers and sell the Green Book. And indeed, in the 1940s, about a third of the dealers were Black. The guides were used by vacation travelers as well as those who traveled for work. You may recall the movie The Green Book about pianist Don Shirley, who toured in the South with a bodyguard and a copy of The Green Book. Negro League baseball players like Buck O'Neill of the KC Monarchs found the Green Book to be essential when traveling for games. The guides were not compiled by Victor Hugo Green alone. Alma was a collaborator and editor and continued to publish it for several years after Victor's death in 1960. And for the last dozen years of the Green Book, a support staff of 4 was recognized in many issues. The final issue of the guide carried a statement on page 2, arming its readers with important information about state and federal discrimination laws. And I quote, "Civil rights, facts or fiction. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a new Bill of Rights for everyone, regardless of race, creed, or color. Effective at once, every hotel, restaurant, theater, or other facility catering to the general public must do exactly that. 31 state laws already in effect have even stronger provisions." So our project, well, not our project, the website project was started by 3 independent researchers located in Maryland, Virginia, and Rhode Island, respectively. And they began their work after the digitization by the New York Public Library of its Green Book collection in 2016. They made some presentations and were encouraged by the interest of other scholars. At the same time, our own Chris Wiegren began to compile preliminary information on the status of Connecticut sites from these issues that were available online. And Alyssa Lozapone, then a Connecticut SHPO staff member, having attended one of those presentations about the project in Rhode Island, volunteered to work on some case studies. The researchers developed a website, The Architecture of the Negro Traveler's Green Book, to share information and encourage further research and understanding. The goal is to document the history and status of every building listed throughout the Green Books, and ultimately to help preserve extant buildings. These sites reflect how African Americans avoided the aggravations, embarrassments, and hazards of racial discrimination when traveling or vacationing, and how they opened businesses to that end. In 2021, the original research team reached out to check on our progress in Connecticut, and that contact was ultimately the impetus for the intern project, which we began to organize in earnest in the fall of 2022. Preservation Connecticut staff reached out to Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor of Political Science at SCSU, and one of our board members, for advice and help in enlisting students. And we also talked to Leah Glazer, Public History Professor and Coordinator at CCSU. And so we welcomed on board Daniela Occhioneri, Senior at SCSU, and Cecilia Puckhaber, a CCSU student. With our team assembled, we invited Calvin Ramsey, playwright and author of works about the Green Book, to share his knowledge and experience. He was then working in New Haven on another project. And then from January through June of 2023, the team conducted site visits, connecting with current occupants when possible, taking photographs, conducting research, and writing findings on the extant sites. Daniela wrote a short context statement for Connecticut for the project. Oops, excuse me. The majority of sites, Green Book sites in Connecticut, well, I apologize. There are 122 Green Book listings in 23 towns in Connecticut across the years. Only 39 buildings survive, 78 have been demolished, lost in some cases to urban renewal, And the exact location and the status of any related buildings is unknown for 5 properties in rural settings in Pomfret, Sharon, and Stonington. The majority of sites were in urban settings and industrial cities within established communities of color in Greater New Haven, Greater Hartford, Waterbury, Bridgeport, and New London. Locations typically coincided with easy access from major thoroughfares, off the Merritt and Wilbur Cross parkways or the coastal Route 1 Boston Post Road, and other routes connecting major cities. Later, as sections of interstate highways 95, 84, and 91 began opening between 1958 and the late 1960s, motels with easy highway access began to appear. Line of once fashionable downtown hotels, they started turning to the Green Book in the late 1950s in search of new customers. Although I should mention here, the Elton Hotel that's shown in the upper right corner on this slide was actually desegregated for employees and guests by its owner, Clyde Jennings, in 1949. Green Book sites generally fall into 2 broad categories: those owned or operated by African Americans in their communities, and larger commercial properties such as hotels, motels, and resorts with white or corporate ownership. Over half of the listings were for places to overnight, and among those, tourist homes, together with salons, were virtually always the business domain of Black women. Mostly married, sometimes widowed or divorced, these women might supplement household incomes or be sole providers. Renting rooms by the night was a common way for households, white and Black, to bring in income during and after the Depression, and before motels dotted the landscape following World War II. It seems possible, however, that the practice endured a bit longer in Black communities. So to share the highlights of what we found in Connecticut, I'm going to present examples through the lenses of community and types of services, beginning with community centers and the women behind them. The Young Women's Christian Association was established in 1858 in New York City to improve, quote, the temporal, moral, and spiritual welfare, unquote, of working women. A YWCA opened in Bridgeport in 1895, but like country YWCAs at the time, provided support services only to white women. Black women in New York City, Poughkeepsie, St. Paul, Dayton, St. Louis, and Chicago were the first to organize and open branches for their communities in the 19-teens, and named them for Phyllis Wheatley, 18th century emancipated slave and the first known published African-American poet. Bridgeport opened a Phyllis Wheatley branch on Beach Street around the turn of the century. It provided services and activities ranging from dance lessons to social clubs and school events, as well as rooms for the night. In a 1983 oral history, former superintendent of schools and YWCA Finance Committee member Geraldine Ferrara Johnson called it a haven for Black people. As the YWCAs began to segregate in the late 1930s and early 1940s, a new single YWCA facility for Black and white women was built on Golden Hill Street. The neighborhood house in Waterbury was founded in 1923 by a diverse interdenominational group as a community center for the local African-American population. In its first years, it met at the home of Alice Kingsbury, member of a prominent Waterbury family, who donated a new building at 81 Pearl Street as a home for recreation plan programs. It was listed as a tourist home in the Green Books for 26 years, but it was also a gathering space where volunteers were inspired and organized by Leila Alexander, lived upstairs, to fight for causes such as better housing, employment, and education. Alexander had organized a Waterbury branch of the NAACP from this location in 1942. The neighborhood house served travelers, recent immigrants, and local residents at this location until moving in 1970 to a new facility. The building is still used for cultural and communal events hosted by Zion Baptist Church. And within a 2-block radius of the neighborhood house, there were several tourist homes and an AME Zion church. This type of clustering within an existing Black community was typical across other cities as well. Like many of their generation, Mary and Sidney Johnson moved from southern states in 1916 as part of the Great Migration. They established the first Black-owned undertaker business in Hartford. Mary let out rooms to Black travelers here, listing in every annual edition of the Green Book. The house no longer stands, but Mary's story is an important one. She was politically and civically active here her entire life in Hartford. She registered to vote in 1920, the first year women could participate in state and federal elections. She was a member of several organizations that helped her fellow African Americans. She founded a community house where newly arrived Black women could acquire skills for employment. And she ran for state House rep in 1948. You can find out more on Hartford's Black Heroes Trail website. While most of the Connecticut listings were for places to spend the night, some of which also had restaurant offerings, travelers could find other services in cities as well: beauty salons and barbershops, service stations, taverns and nightclubs, drugstores, liquor stores, and in one case in Waterbury, a tailor. I'm going to explore a couple of the urban communities and services next. The greater Hartford area offered by far the most services for Black travelers in the Green Book. They were largely located in the Dixwell Avenue neighborhood, a center of African American business, institutions, culture, and homes. Much of the neighborhood was changed by 1960s urban renewal projects, but 4 buildings survive. The Monterey opened in 1934 and listed in the Green Book for 20 years as a restaurant. But it wasn't just a restaurant. It was a jazz club that hosted great entertainers like Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, and Nat King Cole. When the team was there, we met an older gentleman sitting across the street outside, and he remembered going to the club a few times and seeing Sammy Davis Jr. perform. Earlier this year, the city approved purchase of the building to preserve and rehab it in consultation with the community, likely for commercial space and an affordable apartment. Frances Harris ran a beauty parlor from at least 1949 through 1960 or later. Early Green Book listings had it in a small 1-story addition to a residence on Gough Street, which is still a beauty parlor today called Sharper Image. The stylist at work in this small shop told us that she remembered Mrs. Harris as her cousin had worked for her for a time. Harris gave up the storefront in 1947, not long after the death of her husband, a railroad fireman, in 1949. And she used her home on Orchard Street, just 4 blocks away, listing in the Green Book through 1955. Mrs. Harris lived at 734 Orchard Street for about 20 years. And her salon, like so many even today, wasn't just about hair. It was also a place to gather and share news about the neighborhood. It had the 2nd largest number of Green Book listings for commercial services. Here, too, they were largely centered within an African American community in the North End along Main Street, and all within walking distance. The Turf Club, a tavern and nightclub, was listed for 10 years at 2 different locations on Main Street. Though little is known about its services, they had in common Mrs. Thelma Jackson. She'd come north from Georgia with her family and started at the club as a waitress before becoming manager in 1949. A bit of upward mobility. A few years after the Turf Club closed in 1953, the building became home to the Carpe Diem Fraternity Club, begun by 5 Hartford public high school classmates. Its members are known to have included prominent men in the community, such as John C. Clark, the first Black City Council member, and Bose, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Bose Barlow, a municipal judge and state senator. Henry Bell Williams had moved up to Hartford from Georgia with his family in 1920. He offered haircuts and shaves as early as 1925 and opened his own shop, Williams Parlor, which he ran from 1937 until at least 1955. And during that entire time, he lived within walking distance of his shop. He moved once after being divorced, but still within the neighborhood. He worked as much as 62 hours a week per the 1950 census. Owner of Ben's liquor store, which was actually adjacent to Williams' Parlor, and his wife were Jewish immigrants from Russia who lived a few blocks west of the shop from sometime before 1940 to around 1960 when they moved to West Hartford. The shop had been robbed in February of that year and brought back memories of the 1941 holdup at the store that had resulted in Ben's brother's death. A few years later, in 1968, the store had been looted in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's assassination. The Kravitsky family moved away, and their story can perhaps be read as a microcosm of some of the changing dynamics in the North End. Sam's service station was one of 3 in Hartford included in the Green Book starting in 1950. There were only 4 listed statewide. The 4th one was the WT Garage in Bridgeport, still standing, and you might have noticed a small photograph of that on the map that I showed earlier. Sam's was an Atlantic Gas franchise along Albany Avenue in a diverse neighborhood of immigrants. The franchise seems to have changed hands with some frequency. In 1946, before Sam's, it was Nick's, and in 1951, after, it was Jay-Z's. It was ultimately sold and converted to a cleaner in the 1960s, and it is still owned by that family that runs the dry cleaner. Unlike the other cities we've looked at, New London listings centered almost exclusively on overnight lodging. Of the 10 properties listed in the Green Book, only one wasn't for rooms, but a beauty parlor. It was run by Wilhelmina Boone. She, her husband, and children had moved north from South Carolina by the mid-1920s. She ran her own hairdressing business from around 1930 through 1948 and would have relied on that income to raise her children after the death of her husband in 1934. Her home and parlor were at 96 Main Street, unfortunately since demolished on what's become Eugene O'Neill Drive. So I don't have a picture of that one. Mrs. Maddie Bell ran the Home of the Bachelor. That was the name of it, the Home of the Bachelor. I'd like to know the origin of that one. Born in 1878, her parents had moved to New London from North Carolina and Virginia at the turn of the century. Maddie married Carter Bell in 1905, and the couple moved to New Haven, where Carter was a cook in a club. They separated by 1912, and Maddie returned to New London to the family home on Brewer Street. To support herself, she initially offered hairdresser services in her home, and then opened it to lodgers beginning in 1931. Maddie had a job as a secretary sometime around 1940, but she continued offering rooms through the Green Book until 1947. Hempstead Cottage was the home of Sadie Harrison, who published the Hotel and Apartment Guide for Colored Travelers that we talked about earlier. She served as secretary of the New England People's Finance Corporation, founded by her half-brother, Benjamin Tanner Johnson, the 3rd Black graduate of Harvard Business School. That company offered mortgages and car loans for African Americans who were often turned away by white-owned banks. In the mid-1930s, Sadie rented the cottage to the Linwood Bland family, and as an adult, Linwood Bland Jr. became president of the New London chapter of the NAACP. Now, nothing is known about the Gertrude, but other than the large old Mohican Hotel and Crocker House, it's the only Green Book listed property that survives downtown along Bank Street or Main Street in that area. Mrs. Ava Whittle was born in Virginia in 1888 and was living with her husband Robert in Harlem by 1920. The couple soon moved to 785 Bank Street in New London, where Robert worked briefly as a waiter before he died, still only in his mid-40s. Eva seems to have managed lodgings at several locations, including at 785 Bank Street, though she herself had moved upon her husband's death. Other locations included 38 and 42 Mercer Street in the mid-1930s and 46 Hempstead Street, where she lived in the mid-1950s. Ava died in 1965 at the age of 77, still planning to rent out rooms as evidenced by the listing in the 1966 issue of the guide. And I think it would be really interesting in some of these cases to determine ownership, because in the scope of this project, we didn't look at that issue. The Lighthouse Inn was built in 1902 as a summer home called Meadow Court for a steel magnate, Charles Guthrie. After his death, his wife began selling off their estate for development, and the main house was converted to an inn in 1927. It became popular with Hollywood stars in the 1940s. It was only listed in the last Green Book issue, and so it appears to fall into the category of established hotels that turn to outlets like the Green Book to attract new customers with the erosion of their traditional clientele. Motels were built to take advantage of the business opportunities presented by the boom in travelers on the two-lane highways of the 30s and 40s and the sections of the completed interstates in the 50s and 60s. While two of them, one in Clinton and one in Waterbury, advertised in the Green Book beginning in 1957, most didn't do so until 1963 in the lead up to the Civil Rights Act outlawing discrimination. And Howard Johnson's is a case in point. Howard Johnson's was founded as a restaurant chain in 1925 and began adding motels to its properties in 1954. Locations were usually off turnpikes and highways, and East Hartford became home to a restaurant opened in 1958 and a lodge soon after, just off the exit of what had been the Wilbur Cross Highway and was designated I-84 that year. It was Connecticut's first Howard Johnson's motor lodge and restaurant complex. Hojo's initially catered only to white travelers, but the company became the focus of national political attention in 1957 when a Howard Johnson's restaurant in Delaware refused service to the finance minister of Ghana. This prompted organized sit-ins by the Congress of Racial Equality at Howard Johnson's eateries across the country, and more nonviolent rallies took place in Durham at the Howard Johnson's there in 1962. In December that year, the company issued a statement denouncing segregation in its facilities, and by 1963, several locations, including those in Darien, which is now demolished, East Hartford, and Hamden, appeared in the Green Book. The Hamden location, just off the Wilbur Cross Parkway, opened in 1961. It featured many architectural details for Howard Johnson's across the country, including the famous orange roof. And I'm really sharing this one because of the delightful surprise to find, upon visiting the site, despite the remodeling that just about obscures most of the original details, you can still find the classic counter configuration and the metal counter seat frames in the restaurant, and the exterior fenestration and balconies design along the back of the motel. Hojo's decided to add, when Hojo's decided to add motels to the chain, they turned to the architects Rufus Nims and Carl Koch, I've never known how to pronounce his name, Koch, of tech-built fame, to design the gatehouse and rooms. And I'm sorry, I don't know if this actually fits into that, but I wanted to point that out. The Green Books helped African Americans find vacation destinations as well as safe, comfortable services when traveling. Now, virtually no historic fabric is known to survive from these locations. They're an important part of the historic landscape for the Black community, so I wanted to kind of talk about a few of them. In East Haddam was called the Catskills of Connecticut during the 1940s and 50s. At its peak, there were as many as 30 resorts, boarding houses, and camps. These resorts were white-owned and generally specialized in Jewish or Christian vacationers. But beginning in 1961, as traditional visitor numbers decreased, 4 welcomed African Americans: Ted Hilton's, the Dawn Lodge, Moody's Lodge, and Banner Lodge. And I think it's interesting, while most of the promotional materials that I saw for these camps showed white guests and no Black guests in their printed material, we found an advertisement in Ebony magazine in 1965 that specifically called out Dawn Lodge as an interracial resort. Connecticut beaches were de facto closed to African Americans as local shoreline towns enacted ordinances or policies designed to keep out non-residents. But a short strip along Beach Street, in West Haven, where residents were actually largely of Italian heritage, had 4 properties, hotels and taverns, with Black owners and managers. These properties appeared in one way or another in every issue of the Green Book. And so clearly this was a beach place that African Americans could feel comfortable going to in the summer. Camp Bennett was one of only 2 recreational camps for Black children in New England. It was organized in 1934 by the Independent Social Center, a Hartford group which advocated for outdoor and leisure activities for the city's youth. The camp was on a 157-acre former farmstead. The buildings were converted for camp use, but many new buildings went up as well, and one of them was designed apparently by an African-American architect, though I don't know who. It was listed as a summer resort in the Green Books in 1938, 39, and the 1949 Vacation Guide, welcoming families, so not just the kids, apparently. Sites were located in the northwest corner in Sharon, kind of mentioned this already before, in the northeast corner in Pomfret and Stonington, but nothing is really known about them, and it's possible that structures could still be standing. Further research would hopefully kind of tell us more about that. So I know that there was a question queued up from somebody attending today about the locations of some of the Green Book sites and whether they were in, certain towns. The one inquiry was Plymouth. No, there were no listings in Plymouth. And so what I thought I'd do is just put up all the cities that had at least one listing in the Green Books over time. Our project was only a survey, and it really offers only the most basic documentation. There's so much more research to be done. Locating and confirming, as I mentioned, the status of the rural properties. A possible next phase could be fuller documentation to evaluate the possibility of inclusion of extant sites on the state or national register as a reflection of an important mid-20th century social history. A few sites are already listed on the National Register. You might have noticed on the slides I put NR, NRI, NRD. So for those, perhaps nominations could be updated to reflect the findings relative to African American history in the Green Book. So in closing, I need to shout out a big thanks to our two interns, Daniela and Cecilia, who were not only great to work with, but who conducted the field work and research that made it possible to provide this information about the Green Book sites in Connecticut for the website, The Architecture of the Negro Traveler's Green Book. You can look at information that's already available from 20 states, I think it is, on that website, and then keep an eye out for posting of Connecticut sites. And we also did an article in our July-August issue of Preservation Connecticut News. And that is all I have for you, but I'm happy to take questions and answer them if I can.
That's great. Thank you, Renee. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, then we can see everybody. Perfect. So did anybody have any questions for Renee?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna ask if fees for these hotels or motels, were they more, or because they were just these unique locations?
I didn't see any information about that. They didn't seem to differentiate. I mean, some of them talked about that they were great for families, but I didn't have the sense that there was, that there were fee differentials between depending upon race. No, I didn't see that. But that's another area of research.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. There were hotels. I mean, I could have shown more. I guess I realized I really actually did have more time. There were some other interesting projects. For example, there were a group of 3 investors who established the New Englander Motel that had 3 locations. And one of them was Danbury. One of them was, I think, Greenwich and Darien, maybe. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly. I wasn't planning to talk about this. At any rate, they built these, it was around the early 1960s, and they built them as these sort of stylish one-stop places where you could go and have a very cool drink, your martini or whatever, shaken, not stirred or whatever, as well as your lodging. And you also had laundry services and restaurant services, etc. And they found apparently very quickly on that they needed to broaden their advertising. And so that partnership listed all 3 of their properties in the Green Book. And again, it's not in front of me. I don't remember the years, but in those later years. So there are a bunch of instances of that kind of listing. So it doesn't really differentiate between the different audiences that they were seeking in terms of cost or anything like that, but really is just really looking to bring them in as additional clientele.
So Renee, you mentioned at the beginning of the project, the team met with Calvin Ramsey. Can you describe who is he and how did he help frame the project?
Well, so when we were first talking about the internship project and starting to pull it together, I was doing just a little bit of poking around and found the Green Book, a play that was written by Calvin Ramsey, as well as Ruth in the Green Book, a children's book that was written by him. And coincidentally, Chris knew that he was in New Haven, and he was researching. Chris, help me. Are you there? He was researching the first African American to receive his doctorate at Yale. Is that correct?
That's right.
So we reached out to Calvin to see if he might come and talk to us, talk to the interns about writing about the Green Book, and any experiences that he had and what he knew of it. And in his version of the play, he calls to what's the word I want? He calls into question whether or not the Esso stations were always welcoming to African American travelers. And my recollection is that wasn't necessarily out of his own experience, but rather something that he sort of had heard about or wondered about. He didn't share a whole lot. And Chris, if you can jump in if you can speak more about it. But he didn't share a lot in the way of personal experiences.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing was that he's Calvin, obviously he's African American, but he had not known about the Green Book until sometime in the 1980s. He went to visit some relatives in the South, and somebody made a crack about the Green Book, and he didn't know what they were talking about, and that sort of spurred him to find out more, and ended up writing this play.
It was very interesting to talk to him.
Great, thank you.
So Renee, the location of the one in Pomfret is still known. The buildings, it's an old fashioned kind of motor lodge on Route 44. And the buildings are deteriorating very badly. I don't know what they're used for now, but they were kind of a retreat center for a while, maybe into about 20 years ago. And just a fun fact, my in-laws, who are certainly look like me, used to stay there when they came up to Pomfret to visit us because it was the closest place to stay. And since then, some sort of, there are more places to stay in the area, and there are Airbnbs, and none of that stuff existed back in the late 60s and 70s. So they would stay. It was called the Pomfret Motor Inn.
Wow. Well, now the location was identified as being a half a mile west of the intersection of
101 and 44, probably. Of 169 and 44. Or...
So, yeah, what I'm sorry.
44 takes a left turn and it becomes
101 and 44.
Yes.
So does that correspond to what you're talking about then?
Oh yes.
Okay. I couldn't find anything that looked like it. I didn't know where exactly, a half a mile. I don't know.
Well, you have to cut, it's go west on 44. There's a funny old intersection which is very diminished now. I hadn't even know I was going to talk about this. It's there's an old mill there called the Brayton Mill, which is an old grist mill, and there was a blacksmith shop, and there was kind of a little industrial four corners there.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to think, it's on the road has another name that goes up beside it. So it used to be much more of an intersection, and when 44 was developed, it kind of re-sculpted that whole sort of intersection, but it's there.
Great. Oh, thank you. Well, if you can send me like a geo whatever
with my phone, I can go with my phone, and then you can figure out where I took my picture.
Terrific. Thank you. Hey, so while we're here, does anybody else have information? Like in Stonington, Stonington, there were two sites. Let me just double check. And these were later listings. No, it's not in that particular one. Sorry, the Weatanog. Let me look at my stuff. Oh, the Weekataquock Cove Reverdy Ransom Guest House. Sorry, I didn't pronounce that properly, but at any rate, and that was that was sort of intriguing to me because Reverdy Ransom was the name of a minister in the African Method in the AME Church from Ohio, whose father was Native American and whose mother was African American. And so it occurred to me that perhaps this location in Stonington was actually also run by, you know, a mixed heritage, someone of mixed heritage. But it's on Weekataquock Cove. And then there's also another listing there, which was for a boat company. So I'm assuming that the boat company on the cove, you know, you could rent boats or whatever in Stonington. So anybody know anything about that? And then out in Sharon, there were two listings in Sharon. One was called Tall Pines, and one was called Gordon's Tourist Home. And I did find, if it be correct, I mean, I did try and do a little research. This was on top of the internship project, the intern project. And I did find some Gordons living in Sharon who were African American at the time of the listing, but you know, I haven't been able to put that together. So if anybody has any leads on that, please feel free to share.
And Renee, Caroline just put in the chat that the Pomfret Historical Society is having a bus tour this weekend, and the Old Motor Lodge will be included.
Oh, okay, great. Seems I didn't do my homework very well for this, did I? Sorry, guys.
That's why we do this. Pick up everything. And then Ruth also put into the chat, it would be interesting to capture this knowledge with picture and audio about the sites and reaching out to the historical societies, and perhaps using software program story maps to make an interactive history about the project.
Oh, okay. That's beyond my technical expertise, but sounds like a great idea.
So the website that University of Virginia is hosting, what does that look like? How are they portraying?
So let's see, if I'm clever enough to do this, I can share my screen again. But basically the slide, well, I can show you, if I go back, the slide in which I talked about that, it was pieces of it. So let me just see here what I can do. Okay, so I'm going to share screen and I'll just show the website to you if that works. Do you want to do that?
Yep, go ahead. And Jordan just put the link in the chat too.
Okay.
For everybody.
So this is the website. And so it talks a little bit about the project. So it's based out of UVA because one of the researchers is at UVA. And you can look at, so it categorizes the issues, and then you can look at what was listed in each issue. It shows the states. As you can see, Connecticut isn't here yet, but I think Virginia is a really fairly well done one, just because it was one of the project researchers who started it. And it's, you know, same sort of mapping idea. Establishments, they break down into general categories. So automotive, for example, so you can cross-reference if you're looking for, you know, a particular thing. And then people, I'm certainly, you know, hoping that some of the people in Connecticut will get picked up and included here. Actually, Marian Anderson, as I'm sure many of you know, lived in Connecticut in Danbury. Doesn't say much about her, but she was an opera singer. Resources, you know, links to other resources about the team, and then, you know, an option to contact as everybody has. So that's the site.
Is that what you were thinking, Ruth, or were you thinking something different?
I was thinking was you have a site at the same time when you want to present to educators or to possibly teachers, they're often going to want or maybe ask for a template for a lesson plan. So basically with story maps, you can take that platform and all that information that you have there, you can create a timeline from the first one from 1938. And you could probably group it from 1938, do one story map to maybe 1950. So you can do two different ones to look at different errors. And within that story map, you can put a link to maps. You can create a map in there. You can link to videos. You could link to audios. You could link, so you can embed information in there. So you could start with, here's the Green Book Project. Here's 1938. Here's who first created it, top highlights, and then just easily go through there. And then that gives you a platform for outreach, for conversations with teachers, schools, professors, and a way to have a presentation just right there. So that's one thought that I've now been trying and I'm just starting to do. And then also, as you have all these images, you can use I'm using a video software platform, and I can put the images in and just create a short 30-second video with images that you can just share, and you could embed as well in the story maps. And I've been just learning this within the past few weeks. So it's just, and this technology is fairly simple once you figure it out. And so and also story maps, if you want to look further, it's also being used by the Library of Congress as a platform for their communication with educators. So that's how I got to know that platform, was through their suggestion of what they've been using as a conversation or mode of transforming history into visual.
So Elaine Gold shared in the chat a link to a story maps thing. Sorry, I don't know this what to call it.
It's a Gethsemane Cemetery. It's a African-American cemetery in Bergen County.
Yeah, no, but I meant the story maps thing. Like, I don't know what that is thing.
It's a GIS mapping system that you can tag in other information and broader scope.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
really
anyway,
nice.
that the link is in there. Okay, I see.
I mean, you could probably reach out to Southern Connecticut. They have a geography department, and their students might be looking for internships. This might be a very good project to piggyback and bring them in on, and to see what they could do in there. Because when I was way back there as a geography major, there was a year-long class in GIS. So if they still have that, I would think of bringing them on and saying, hey, what can you do between GIS, story maps, and all these different platforms, and allow that class to be able to do, to produce a possible way of a good, of an outreach tool, or just let the students take the project on, see what they can do with the information. And that, so you might want to link over with Southern Connecticut, and they also have at Southern Connecticut a library program. So you might be able to link between those two. So you might look into that as a vehicle for something that's local, and it's right between Hamden and New Haven. So you're right in Green Books.
Yeah,
Look,
that's a great idea. Another intern program. And
yes, thank you.
Yeah.
It's terrific. Good. We learned something new. Did anyone else have any questions or comments? Well, thank you so much, Renee, for sharing the project with us and for leading the project. And Chris, you're still on, for also helping us with the project.
Yeah. Yep. Chris was a big help too. And, you know, as I say, I mean, I think the tantalizing thing about this project is that it shows how much, you know, look at me, I'm a white person. I know nothing about this history, and it shows how much there is to learn about it, about the, you know, the life of African Americans traveling in a certain time in our state and elsewhere. And so, as I say, a lot of research opportunities here, I think.
Yes. Thank you all very much for joining us. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.